Oh, thank you. Are you good? Are you planning to come to the meeting or no? Or he's gonna do, but I don't know if I have enough battery, but we did find it, the other power cords that is.
Okay, so we share power cords, so you can use mine.
No, it's I have a different, it's slightly different. Because I checked when we were, my shape is a little different.
Okay, I thought we had.
I need the better one, I think. The one you're recommending, Michael.
Oh, you did, okay. Okay, sure.
I don't think I'm gonna be able to.
Okay, well then it's in my favor, because I might need to use that one since there's now a problem.
Yes, I have to.
Not trivial problem.
Like this. Perfect. Start it. Yes.
Do you know the website?
The room keeps me
Do you
confined.
need this? I was using it.
Oh, no,
yesterday.
I'm
All right.
Rick just threw it at me.
And
I think that's drawing good.
Yeah, it's right.
Let's try. Because I've never managed to get to the conference.
oh, really? Okay, then let me just
I do have my slides on that stick, so we could use your machine, but then of course.
Yeah. It must, is it
No,
probably
let us-
yeah, let's have you log in and so they have the login information needed. We don't need to get on the website. We'll just-
So I was going to show you. So this is interfaces that people make and then you can click them
Yes, that's right. Yeah, FS events.
or
So you can do this now too.
yes. So if you just do anything.
Luckily, I got in a lot of work this morning, so now the presentation ought to be.
You just build it like you want. So there's a model behind it.
And
So one, you know, you see the picture when you look down. It doesn't look on the screen as if one is looking at all.
Yes, you're right. Yeah,
So I'm trying to lift my.
Maybe
This is what the camera looks. This is what the camera looks like right now.
Okay.
That should be.
this is
Should
really.
you, do you want? Is this an okay zoom? And do you want to be center of the video?
I want to be the center of the video, but then of course I assume that in
I don't need always.
in the zoom picture, really, so the people will see my slides
Yes.
and a picture of me.
Yes.
And that picture of me is exactly like the picture here.
That's
Okay, so we should then, of course, try to reduce it afterwards, because I am able to stay relatively stable.
Yeah.
So this is okay level of zoom, because this is the only control. There's no
Yes.
remote controls.
It's true, but then I think I would try to make it so more on my face,
Oh,
so
okay.
smaller than, because.
Okay, let's see how far we can see.
Exactly.
It doesn't hurt
Oh, this control is very.
to do all this.
This is
Yeah.
looks like this is maximum.
This is the maximum.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
perfect.
I don't have to take some power from this.
It's behind, but there is nothing to do about that.
Yeah.
It would of course have been nice.
Oh.
Okay, fine.
Okay.
Then,
I'm gonna run to the toilet.
so what we want to do is first of all to get on the.
Okay.
I'm gonna go grab a lunch bag and I'll come back.
Welcome in.
You just go.
Have you comment, Jorgen?
Yep.
Yes.
Take some with me.
Okay.
I can take my thing.
No, that's okay.
I would, like,
Were you in the modelling session, the simulation workshop?
no, I
No.
just.
Oh, okay.
explained it to
No,
me.
it's just.
I was just doing the like interface building
then Solveig would be your
Yeah.
perfect partner. She is.
It's
quite
okay.
good.
I'm
Yeah,
glad.
it's
Skype,
like
so there's
you
no
know,
distraction.
Yes.
And you keep up and then it just kind of goes, you know. So you think, oh well, at least we'll record and pause and stop, you know.
I'm absolutely not familiar with that.
With Skype.
Oh, okay.
But I like this.
Yeah.
Messaging.
It feels more
Okay,
modern.
so
Yeah,
Yeah.
more modern, that's right.
Yeah,
Join a
and it
meeting.
feels, oh, it's just something about the fonts and the lines and things. I think it's just got a, you know, it's clearly been difficult. They were both
Zoom
built.
account that closes down after. Can you
I
send an
believe so.
invite?
I think
Oh,
Bob
sure,
originally
yeah,
developed
that's
Expensive,
because then
then the
My machine
Blue,
chooses
and he
the
developed
Office
Stella as well.
Zoom.
So, you know,
it's a higher quality.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let me email you.
Yeah. Right. Let me leave my little setup.
Remember you exist. See.
You're, yeah, quite a lot of mail. Oh, there we go.
There you go. Perfect. And then I will open this one.
That's nice. It's from yesterday.
That's from yesterday's. I click on the wrong one.
There's more to go up here.
Next.
Ah, there it is.
Ah, there's
Ah,
this one. So, great. Hello. Nice of you to come. Please, because then at least there is one audience.
No, that was.
Got it?
Yeah.
and spots. Testing. Yeah, there's an echo.
Yeah.
Testing. Testing. Okay, good. One little problem. Okay. Okay, great. So we'll need
That's,
your.
so then we will try to open the, can you show me the full view? Let's see if I view here, speaker, gallery. So gallery is the number of people that are currently
Yeah.
looking. So this is David and this is someone else. And Carsten, I wonder.
Yeah,
Okay,
but
gradually it will be many more.
yeah, but your presentation is going to be here.
Okay, so
This
that's,
screen can be if you want to see people on Zoom.
okay,
This is where we need your
yeah.
presentation.
But then I presume can, because I don't
Yes.
need this one.
Um,
We should move it over there. So it is, where is it stuck?
it's a little stuck.
It's a little stuck. Okay, then we just leave it as is.
Yeah, it's a little stuck.
Yeah.
But, if it's distracting, I can turn it off, but
That's true. Yeah, but let's now find a place to have the manuscript, because the manuscript is the most important part. But let me first start the presentation. Yes. And would it be possible to get the presentation on the big screen rather than where is that? Order?
No, I just need to transfer the file because this is a different computer, so I just need to transfer.
Okay.
Hello, Jorgen. This is David and everyone. Is there any way to increase the light in the room? Because it looks a bit dark with the camera.
So we will check. That's luckily. So have you, David? So have you spoken to Taku here?
Yeah, we emailed.
So he's luckily here helping
Yeah.
out.
How's that?
That
And-
makes it.
No, it's not actually. It's not better now, unfortunately.
Do it all the way around.
The face is very dark. Yeah, exactly.
We need to darken what is behind me.
Yeah. Yeah, this is much better, but yeah, now it's much better, I think.
I guess that's.
But it's still slightly dark, but I guess there's nothing to do about that. It's all right, absolutely all right. It's just for the recording. I was thinking of this. And I would lower the camera just a little bit if you can.
No, it cannot be lowered because it is in this.
Yeah, the control is not it's very coarse.
Ah, okay, all right. Yeah, no, now it's much better, much better. This is perfect.
Well, we didn't change it. So it's the point is that I have to look at the top of the windows above the heads of the audience in order to look as if I am looking in the camera, which is incredibly difficult because I do need notes to keep on time.
No,
So
but it's much better. The angle is much better now. So this is good.
every now and then I will do like this so that it seems to the whatever interspace that I am here. So let's see, we wanted to find the talk.
So you want the power.
That would be because then I don't have to turn my head so far down. So
Then your manuscript is that a separate file?
that's everything. So
Okay,
this is going to be there.
Perfect.
So I think we will make it in time.
Okay, yeah.
Here is, then I want to. Yes.
It's up to you. If you feel more comfortable on your computer, on your laptop, it's great. You can run it. But if you want to use the bigger screen and you don't want the distraction of your own machine.
Is the next well, is this yours?
So if you want your presentation here and you have a printed manuscript, you actually don't need your machine now.
That is actually very true.
Yeah. And you plug in the clicker here.
So we will. I will try to find the manuscript.
So, Tak, I was wondering who can I communicate with in the chat during the presentation if there's any problem?
Yeah, I will be monitoring the chat.
Okay, but can I write to you only in the chat if there's something with the camera or something like that? So I don't have to write.
Of course.
Yeah, so it's your profile, Tak Uno. Perfect.
How are you? Did you get lost on the way?
No.
Is that?
It's your session.
Okay, so there's the one there as a. So I did turn it off. So you see this one?
Oh, is this distracting? I can turn it off.
Just turn it off when I have, since I have the one. Or let it be there. It just changes pictures very slowly.
So halfway through love, right?
That one as well.
Yes.
I have one. Have my phone say. It will now turn itself off.
I am alive still. Good, good. We got back quite late, so I'm glad to see that.
Okay, great.
I have to connect this. Another page.
Study outside.
I will check.
The front row buddy. I need a front row buddy.
Otherwise. Unfortunately.
You've been in workshop. Here, the interface, it's Bob Everline, yeah, which is actually really pretty cool. I need to scrap my current interface. I don't think it's going to content.
Jürgen,
Yeah.
can you see this?
Yes.
Is this small, too small?
It's perfect. Okay. And why don't you, can you start it from 0? Or can you, or you do it the other way I said?
Oh, I thought you wanted to go
Yeah,
down.
perfect. And it starts at 60?
60, yeah, 1 hour.
Perfect. Okay, to those of you who are here before we start, the reason why we're doing so much hassle in the taping is that this tape we're going to use in the 1st of September as the scientific proof, ridiculously, that the model behind the book that we will launch on the 1st of September exists, and that it has been presented to a so-called competent audience. So this is done. We do this at the same time to save me time, so I can just get back and continue revision. So please, I'm delighted that there are people here. Please shake your heads and say boo, or give the sign of boo when you lose track, so that I get a feel for whether this thing progresses well or not. Okay, so I'm very happy if someone nods and says that things are going well, but I'm equally interested in getting signs that here there is a logical flaw or that you lost me.
Boo, you said so-called.
So-called, this is, you know, you're a scientific audience in the sense that of the PR people in this project who are, you know, totally non-scientific.
That's the audience we need to reach.
And this is the point. So it's this is a very complex thing to do, and it's particularly complicated because the model is so big and it contains so many important assumptions that the artist will try to cook it down to the essentials without being incredibly empty or boring. So this is a tough call. I tried for the last 4 months to make this talk. So we will see. Hello.
I am so sorry.
You're not going to
Because
be
my plane is there. So I just wanted to say, I am so sorry that I cannot.
Let's listen to the tape.
No, that won't be as fun.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Everything fine. Safe job.
So close the door so we can. And I would be very happy if you sit over there, you know, not there because I need to look in this direction in order not to look idiotic on the.
You look at me?
No, it's actually much better if you are there rather than. At least just to the edge of that because this is not getting too good. We have to abide, right?
Let's stay here because I have a little bit of problem.
Good.
The Azores.
I am also running the meeting. So I just start.
The UK.
Geographic
Okay, start. Good morning. I'm here to talk about a new world model. It's called the Earth4All model of human well-being on a finite planet towards the year 2100. My friends and I have written a book, a new report to the Club of Rome, celebrating the 50-year anniversary of the 1972 report called The Limits to Growth, which was actually the first report to the Club of Rome. And this new report is called Earth4All, and it will appear in September 2022. The report looks at what is necessary in order to increase the well-being of humanity during the rest of this century. That is the object, to try to reach a world where human well-being, the well-being of the working majority, is better than it is now. The report is largely verbal. It's written in words and for the lay audience, but it is supported by the Earth4All system dynamics model. This one can be described as an early example of a new class of integrated global assessment models. It is a model that includes both the human world and the natural world and the interaction between the two. It is based on the system dynamics methodology and consequently is a causal simulation model. it is not an optimization model where one is trying to optimize GDP or some other indicator of human well-being. It is rather a model which is capable of generating a number of internally consistent scenarios for the next 50 years. Or to be precise, the model is able to generate forecasts for those variables we are interested in the global system. It's not a model of the world, it is a model of those phenomena we're interested in. And primarily, that is the development of human well-being over this period. The perspective of the model is much like that of World3, which was the model that was supporting the Limits to Growth book 50 years ago. 50 years after the Limits to Growth, we can conclude that the world has followed basically the forecasts of the scenarios in the Limits to Growth book. You can see here on the slide 4 of the 12 scenarios from the Limits to Growth for population developments from 1972 to the 2100, and overlaid is actual development of the world during this period. And you see that the population has grown, it's essentially doubled over this period, and followed the starting point of most of the scenarios in Limits to Growth. And in the same way, you see that industrial output has actually increased over this period. You can see how the human well-being has been developing over this period. Interesting, you know, the black dots starting now to indicate the leveling off in average human well-being, measured as the Human Development Index during the last decade or so. And the big question is, how is this going to develop further? So we have seen growth. We have not yet seen the collapse that occurs in some of the more famous scenarios from the Limits to Growth. So what will happen to well-being during the next 50 years? Will it continue to decline? Will it grow? Will it oscillate? That is the real research question, and this is the question we're trying to elucidate using a new system dynamics model called Earth4All. It is interesting then to say that when we're talking about well-being, we are not talking about average well-being of the whole population. We have split the population in two groups, workers and owners. So workers are roughly the 90% of the population, and owners are those that make more in a year than what they spend, and consequently have the resources available for investment. So, and so the goal here is to increase not the well-being of the totality, but primarily the well-being of the 90%. And one should remember that at this point in time, of the 90%, 95% belongs in the global south. So this, with the 8 billion people we are at this point in time, the West and the rich world contains 1.5 billion. The other, 6.5 billion is the audience, essentially the majority of the audience for the study. Since the presentation of this model is unbelievably long, it ends up being several thousand pages. There is very little I can do except trying to compact this into something which is short, but then of course omits many of the most interesting details. Those are available easily for those of you who can run models, because the model is available in Stella and in in Benzim, and you call me and you get the model, and then you can of course do all the checks and balances and change the assumptions as you want. My presentation today is going to last for another 52 minutes. In order for you not to fall asleep during this, I start by showing you an aggregate result. So this is a relatively high level causal diagram of the model. Hopefully in another 52 minutes, you will know a little bit more about what are the main variables, what are the main causal relations. But you can see already on this model, up in the corner, the population sector, left-hand corner, population sector. In the middle, you see the private sector, which is the private part of the economy. Then there's the public sector, which is a separate entity. You have the labor market in the top, you know, how owners and workers fight over the worker share of output. To the right, there is the ecological footprint. It's the human use of energy and food and its impact on temperatures. To the top right hand, you see the integrated well-being sector, and down in the left-hand corner are all the financial aspects of the economy, which typically are much more short-term and which I will only mention at the end of the presentation once, or if I have the time when we get that far. And the model runs very nicely. It's typically the base run looks like this. It matches history from 1980 to 2000, and then it calculates the effect essentially of it's parameterized in such a way that it matches the history from 1980 to 2000. And then we assume the same decision style being kept during the next 80 years. So that means that there are no truly extraordinary action in the base run. You know, the truly extraordinary action beyond what we have seen over the last 40 years is then in the policy runs. You see the population growing, peaking, declining. You see the GDP per person continuing throughout. You see global warming, the black line, you know, the world getting warmer and warmer throughout the whole period. You see inequality, the gray line, you know, increasing, but with a 10-year oscillation, which is the fight between the owners and the workers. This is the Marx growth cycle, for those of you who know your history. And then there is the green line, which is the average well-being, the well-being of the majority, which grew, you know, over the last 40 years. It's now stagnating, and in the model, the base run, it's actually declining for the next 50 years before it levels off at a relatively low level. And again, with oscillation depending on distribution. So you might ask, is this possible? You know, is it possible to make a model that can say something meaningful about human well-being on a 50-year horizon? Well, at least we have built the model and it generates reasonable results. So that's the first step. The main answer why I believe this can be done, and my colleagues believe that this can be done, is that we have found in data and in the qualitative history of the past information that shows, or data that shows, that there is a surprisingly stable relationships between human behavior and the GDP per person in the society that they are living in. And that's in many ways the basis for our forecast. We assume that the human beings of the future are going to behave when they are at different income levels in the same way as they behaved over the last 40 years. And let me show you an example of this. So here in this graph, there is fertility. It's the birth rate along the vertical axis, and it is the wealth, the income of the GDP per person of the nation along the horizontal axis, measured in PPP dollars, 2017 PPP dollars. And you see, these are now for the 10 regions that we have split the world into. And you see the yellow line is basically our general assumption based on the underlying data, namely that you start with a high birth rate when incomes are low, and then you move towards ever lower birth rates when incomes rise. You see very helpfully here how good, or I should rather say bad, that approximation is. You see how China looks very different, red line being way below the average development, while the United States is staying with its very high birth rate due to the reasons that we all know. And so, you know, there is variation. So this is a typical example of the heroic assumptions you need to make if you want to try to estimate roughly what will happen to well-being in the future. But the point is, there is apparently a clear systematism. As people get richer, as women get richer, they choose to have fewer children. And then I'll show you very quickly 5 others of these. These are in many ways the core of the predictive capacity of a model like this. So here you have the economic growth rate, which illustrates the fact that as when you're poor, the growth rate is very low. Then while you industrialize, you know, the growth rate is very high, and then it declines as you get richer and richer, and actually gets very close to zero in the end. The savings rate, for those of you who are interested in the macroeconomic parts of this, interestingly, also has a pattern where savings rate decline after as you get richer. Very interestingly, it means that people actually consume more as they get richer, which is contrary to one of the graphs shown yesterday in the conventional view. The capital labor ratio, again, interestingly, seems to increase more or less linearly with income. The government share of GDP is another, you know, very important decision made by societies. And of course, here, tradition and political choice makes a bigger variation among the regions than in the other graphs. But still, there is this obvious tendency that, you know, initially there is no state, then gradually you reach a peak state, and then it tends to decline. Clearly, if we decided to act differently, you know, one can, of course, decide to have higher taxes and a bigger government, and then move away from the yellow line. But we use the yellow line to the global guide to do the surprise-free future, you know, the base run of the model. Here is the energy use per person, which is amazing. This is now the sum of electricity and fossil heat, measured in proper units and added together in the way it should be. And look what it shows is that amazingly, when you reach $40,000 dollars per person per year, you know, the energy use per person does not increase anymore. So there isn't. So here, this is the Kuznets curve in real, you know, for those of you who know what is the Kuznets curve. If you look at CO2 emissions per person, here the spread is very big, but there is again the tendency that it levels off. It is the reason why the country curves decline is that there is technological advance, so that those countries that were at $30,000 per person a year in 1960 had a lower energy efficiency than those that are at the same dollar value at this point in time. So you can improve adaptation here much by introducing explicit technological advance in the graph. Fossil fuel use, again, increases with rising income, and that is it. So these are, if you want to answer in one short answer, how good is the model? It is as good as the approximation that we do when we replace actual developments with the yellow line. This means that the dynamics of the model are reliable, but the numerical values, totally without reliability. It also means that we are building, I'm presenting to you now the one global model applied to global data, but we are at the same time adapting it to the 10 regions. And so when you go down at the regional level, you replace the yellow lines with the continuation of the actual data for the region, and thereby you get a better fit. It turns out, luckily, that the difference in the two ways of calculating the global aggregate, either doing it in this heroic manner or doing it as the sum of 10 regions, gives the same result within the uncertainty range that I have indicated, namely that we only rely on the dynamics in the system, and any type of numerical value is plus minus 50%, plus minus 30% in that order of magnitude. So we want to forecast well-being. We need a definition of well-being in order to do this quantitatively. And what we have done, we have chosen to define the average well-being of the working majority in the following way, depending on 5 components. Those are by the recommendation of what is called the We All Alliance, of the well-being alliance of nations that have chosen to move away from GDP per person as the societal goal. They are using the average well-being as their goal. And our concretization of the 5 goals of the We All Alliance are the following 5. So the first component is worker disposable income, so per person after tax, measured in 2017 PPP dollars per person per year. The second component is public spending per person. Basically saying that if there is a strong state, expensive state that provides health, education, transportation, etc., this adds to the well-being of people beyond their disposable income. The third one, chosen by We All reasonably, is inequality. So clearly, an unequal society is less happy than an equal society. And the way we measure inequality in the model system is to take owner disposable income after tax and divide it by the worker disposable income after tax. So you get the ratio between the owners and the workers. The fourth is environmental quality. And here we use observed global warming as the indicator. We could have added many others, but for simplicity and also because our ability to forecast climate is much higher than our ability to forecast some of the other environmental damages, we use the observed global warming in degrees centigrade above pre-industrial times. And then fifthly, in order to indicate what we all call participation, the engagement in society, we use something we call perceived progress. And basically, this is the rate of increase in well-being during the last 5 years. So this is the simple idea that if well-being is going up, people are happy, they have hopes for the future, and they are not as disgruntled and do not cause as much difficulty for the government as they do when well-being is declining and people are getting increasingly frustrated and starting to rebel. In greater detail, in the next slide, I'm not going to spend time on it. I just show you the equations for how we calculate the worker disposable income, the public spending, the inequality, the environmental damage, and the perceived progress. And the important thing here is that you do not need very many variables, in order to be able to calculate future values of the average well-being index. So I've highlighted them in red. You need a GDP forecast. You need a forecast of the worker share of output. You need worker tax rates. You need the transfers, governmental transfers from the rich to the poor. You need the workforce. You need the national income. You need the government gross income as share of national income. You need a population. You need owner income after tax, worker income after tax, observed global warming, and rate of growth in the average well-being index. This is not many variables compared to the endless number you would have thought was necessary. It still is a large number of them. And the art in the rest of my presentation is to try to get you to feel, how coarsely do we approximate these, I guess it's 10 red variables. And the way I have chosen to do that after a lot of attempts is to actually go into the model and then look at variable by variable, comparing it. So looking what it looks like in the base run from 1980 to 2100, and comparing with history, which is the blue line in this case. So that's actual data from the real world. And then to the right, I indicate a few of the major causal influences that actually determine the graph to the left. It's easy on this first one, which is population, which of course grows as long as fertility is higher than mortality, and as the number of desired children goes down, the blue line to the right, because society gets richer, because there is more health, because there is more education, because there is more contraception, because there is more opportunity for the women. Finally, the population starts to decline and so this is the perspective of the model on the population side, and you see the unbelievable fit to history. Not very, this is of course way beyond the precision level of the model, but it just shows that it is not that difficult when you have a basically correct theory for what's going on to parameterize it in such a way that it fits history. GDP growth is somewhat more interesting. This is the GDP of the next 80 years. You see the red line, there's GDP growing. You see those of you who know systems can see both the inventory cycle, the 4-year business cycle, and you can see the 10-year cycle. So this is a superposition of both the long-term growth, the 10-year mark cycle, and the 4-year inventory cycle. But it basically goes up. It grows in a model, and to the right, you see in the red line how the growth rate is actually declining over time, as one would expect, since the blue line showing how the GDP per person is increasing throughout the period. You see to the left the mismatch between the growth rate in GDP and the observed growth in GDP, which I have left there just in order to indicate, because it's of course very easy to just adjust one parameter in the system so that the two match perfectly. But that hides, the level of heroicness in all of this. And so I've left some of these things just in order to remind you all the time that this model is an incredibly rough approximation to the humongously complicated reality and that exists out. Let's proceed to workforce. So this is the workforce doing the same thing here. You see the Marx growth cycle much better. You also see to the right, the reason, this is the capital labor ratio in the system, which is, how many machines basically there are behind each worker. This is the one that worries people with the robotization of the service sector, which means increasing the capital labor ratio very quickly, which means that unemployment rises faster than it otherwise would have been. The worker share of output is the red line. This is the share of the GDP that actually ends up as salary to workers, and it tends to decline, over time. The government share of GDP in the model system declines because of the yellow line, showing that as you get richer, the role of the government tends to decline. Here you see that historically average for the world is down to roughly 17% of the GDP, while we have parameterized the model at 22. Again, this is the type of thing we can easily change by reducing the tax rates in the system than by reducing the size of the government sector. I leave it here to be able to make that point. Again, if the two matched, you will never have thought about the fact that, this is of course changeable. Public spending per person, the red line to the right, increases throughout and is one of the real drivers of well-being in this coming century. The inequality index is starting to be more interesting. You see inequality rising, both historically. Here the data is the Gini index that is most commonly used as a measure. Our red line is of course a totally different measure. It's the ratio of owner income to worker income, but they have the same trends. And the reason for this is of course the declining taxes over the last 40 years, which we assume in a model system will not be continued. That's of course a heroic assumption. One could of course in the base run assume that that liberalization is going to continue over the next 80 years. I don't think so. And so consequently we have chosen to assume that humanity is moving away from the liberalization move that has occurred over the last 40 years and into, we basically say, a stable situation currently. Energy use grows like the red line, interestingly reaches a peak, roughly 30% above current levels, because the energy use per person in the system define the way we define energy plateaus. Electricity use, the same thing, so the task at hand for the climate people is basically to build enough sun and wind, to produce 12,000 megatons of oil equivalent converted into terawatt hours of electricity per year. I should, for pedagogic purposes, of course, have had electricity measured in terawatt hours of electricity instead of megatons of oil equivalent. There's a factor of 4 between the two. And to the right, you see in the base run how the fraction of low carbon electricity, this is the amount of sun and wind and hydro and nuclear, that is part of the equation. And you see, even in our base run, where we assume decision making along the lines, the same style as during the last 40 years, that fraction actually reaches 50% in the 2050s. So that's my surprise-free forecast. Our surprise-free forecast is that by 2050, we will have roughly half of the world running on renewables and one half of the world running on fossil fuels still. And then, of course, once you know all of the stuff that we know, here comes the CO2 from energy and industry. You see the emissions rising from the approach, so rising from the roughly 15 gigatons of CO2 that was emitted in 1980, and to double that value, roughly, what is this, 32 gigatons. Our surprise-free forecast basically believes that we will reach a peak in CO2 emissions relatively soon, and then decline. That comes out of all the assumptions that I've gone through this far. And the main reason is, of course, the CO2 per GDP, which is, the energy, the true climate efficiency of the economy, which has come down dramatically since 1980. Those are the historical numbers from 65 or 0.65 kilogram per dollar of GDP down to 0.38. And we assume, you can see the thing, the point around 2020 where it accelerates this shift. So we do believe that there will be some deviation from traditional decision making on this in this particular case. And the result is then global warming. The red line is model output. The blue line is what has actually happened over the last 40 years. Once more, we have deliberately included a difference between the two because it is easy to go into the climate model, just twist a few knobs of things that people don't know what is, and get the two curves to match perfectly. So this is again a reminder, and the reason why the global warming occurs in the model is of course that the CO2 concentration increases in the model system like in the real world. And the CO2 crop use here, the red line. So interestingly, we assume, like we did in our former studies 3 years ago and 10 years ago, that the world will only need roughly 30% more crops, at the peak than it needs now. And that is the red line, which is our forecast. The historical data here is the blue line, which you see is way above the red line, the red curve. The reason is, of course, that the blue line is FAO statistics, and they define crops in a different manner than we do. And consequently, if we multiply our definition of a ton of crop with 1.4, we get the green line. And that's what is the difference between the two assumptions. Why do I include this thing here? It is to make the point that the FAO statistics on food, which is the best we have, are wildly uncertain, internally inconsistent, and there is everything wrong with the FAO data. And so matching those data does not really make sense when you're building a causal model. But we show here what types of patches you then need to do if you want to satisfy the demand from the masses that your model should fit history. So again, I include this in order to highlight, how difficult it is to actually try to make a model. And then to the right, you see what drives food production. It's fertilizer use per person, and it is the crop use per person. Cropland, one needs land in addition to fertilizer in order to produce the food. And you see that over the last 40 years since we wrote the Limbuster Growth Book and I made the agriculture model in limits, cropland has been relatively stable at 1,500 megahectares. The reason why we have been able to increase the food production dramatically is, of course, increased use of fertilizer. So that's what has happened in the past. And you see, going forwards in the base run, we will need some more cropland because we have reached saturation, basically, in the use of fertilizer in parts of the world. And that means that we will need to cut the forest. So you look to your right, the forest area, the blue line, which is an indicator of the remaining biodiversity, is actually declining, while the urban land at the bottom and the wasteland, which is not plotted, are increasing. So we are in the process shifting, from undisturbed forests to destroyed land. And then finally, we reach the sum of the pudding, which is the average well-being index. And you see, as you have gleaned from the earlier ones to the left, that the average well-being index rises during the first, 1980 to 2010, and it basically declines until 2050 and stays at a low level. And this is, of course, because income, disposable income and public services per person are increasing. So that's the positive that pulls it up. And the negative thing is, of course, the warming that goes up and inequality that warming that goes up and inequality that goes up. And sooner or later, the two negative effects overwhelms the positive effects, and you get a decline in well-being. It levels off because gradually the warming levels off, and also the inequality starts to level off. So if you run the model far enough out, probably the well-being will start to increase again. And I'm then including on the graph to the left also what happens to GDP per person in order to make the following point. Notice that over the next 30 years, we will be in a situation where the GDP per person grows because the total productive activity of per person, labor productivity, is going to continue to rise, while at the same time, the new indicator is going down. So this shows, this is included in order to show how useless it is to use GDP per person as an indicator when you want to improve the well-being of the human being. To the right, we have the important indicator, the social tension indicator, the blue line. And the blue line is basically, as I said before, the derivative of well-being. So when well-being is rising, you see social tension going down. When well-being is starting to decline, between 2000 and 2050, the well-being, the social tensions rise, and then they stay at that high level, during the rest of this century. In sum, when you then want to present the total result, there are, of course, a couple of hundred variables in the system, so it gets very messy. Here you have at the top the 6 variables that I indicated initially: the population, the growing GDP, the global warming, the inequality, the average well-being, and the social tension. And now you should know a little bit more about how we calculate those variables. At the bottom, there are some other indicators just for the use of you. The blue line at the bottom is the one that interests most people in the South. This is the number of people that are below $15,000 per person a year in GDP. $15,000 in GDP per year per person is the level necessary in order to satisfy the Sustainable Development Goals. So societies that are at $15,000 typically satisfies most of the Sustainable Development Goals using conventional decision techniques. What is $15,000? Interestingly, it is the GDP level of China. So China is now exactly at that point. The world average is also at 15,000, which is also interesting. Europe is at 50,000, the United States at 60,000, Norway even beyond this, and then India and Africa south of Sahara are down into the $2,000 to $4,000 per person. So it's a wide spread between regions, but the sum of this is a population that below 15,000 that has come down a little bit during the last 40 years and will actually decline to 0 during the next 50 years or so. That's our best forecast for the speed at which poverty is going to disappear in the world. I've spoken about the energy use that peaks in red, the crop use that peaks in green, the government share of the GDP that rises a little bit because they start to spend money on what is necessary to save the world, and the fertilizer use going down because of the essentially effect to try to reduce waste, to make the transition to red meat and to introduce regenerative agriculture at a speed which is profitable, which is a low speed, but it helps. And then finally, the greenhouse gas emissions, the black line, shows the surprise-free development where we peak relatively quickly. We cut of the order of, what should I say, 25% by 2050, and then another 30-40% by the year 2100. So this is, of course, way below what is the ambition of the Paris Agreement and the global society, but we don't believe that they know what we're talking about, basically. They're not going to implement the solutions we think that they are promising to implement. So what can you use a model like this for? The most obvious thing is, of course, to try to look at policy intended to reverse the trend in well-being. So the model says that in surprise-free future, well-being is actually going to decline. With great variation between regions, but basically down, both in the rich and in the poor. So the purpose of, or one purpose of the Earth4All project is, of course, to promote a political program that is intended to improve the well-being of the working majority of the planet during the next 50 years. There has been a huge debate in the project about what level and what are the types of the policies that should be included in this package. We have, after a lot of debate, ended up with 5 turnarounds. There are 5 transformational changes that needs to be done in order to get to a better world. And it is they're called the poverty turnaround, the energy turnaround, the food turnaround, the empowerment turnaround, and the inequality turnaround. I'm presenting them here in a more model-based sequence, and which is easier to understand than the political program that will be, presented in words in a way that is easily understood. So the first idea is to eliminate global poverty. That means to get the blue line of the number of people below $15,000 to fall more rapidly. And the way we do this is basically to use new growth models instead of following the liberalization, the Washington consensus, the old-fashioned development strategies. We are following the role of Guatemala, Costa Rica, China. So more plan and less markets. So you do what Norway did between 1945 and 65, when you basically built a nation according to plan, instead of letting it be dominated by the market thinking. The second thing is to stop climate change, which is very simple. It's simply to replace fossils with wind and sun efficiency and carbon capture and storage. The third thing is to halt biodiversity decline. So how do we do this? Introduce regenerative agriculture to protect remaining forests. So we basically insist that one should manage with existing land area and existing fertilizer use, and then rather reduce waste, reduce red meat, reduce and accelerate, subsidize regenerative agriculture. On the fourth, I call it stop population growth. This is not politically acceptable language in the very international group that we represent. And so there it is called empowerment of women. It is exactly the same thing. It is supplying education, health, contraception, and opportunity to all the women of the world, which has 2 side effects. It makes the women happy. And secondly, it makes the women choose to have very much fewer children, so that we reduce the consumption pressure in the long run, so that we don't simply have a solution for the current 8 billion people, but that we actually get the population down during the next 40 years. And then the final one, reduce inequality, which is terribly simple. It's simply to make the rich pay for the higher well-being of the working majority. So you take from the rich and give to the poor. And here it is important to mention the main numbers. The fact is that the cost of doing all of this is, we say, somewhere between 2 and 4% of global income. And so if you got hold of 2 to 4% of the money, you could then pay for the shift of labor and capital from dirty activity to clean activity, from what is profitable to what is needed in order to make a better world. And the numbers are such that the 10% richest in the world control 50% of global income. So all you need to do is to slap a 10% tax on the 10% richest of the world, and you get the 2 to 4% of the GDP that you need to pay for this program. Of course, this is what we propose. This is never going to be accepted, but at least it is important to make people aware that if in a democracy they were smart enough to band together, the 90% that would, not be affected by the tax rise, then we could solve the problem for everyone. Here is the detail in how we represent those policy changes in the model system. Not particularly interesting at the level we are now. Very interesting when you start discussing policy implementation, how do you actually get the money out of the rich, etc. Then I want to show you what is the effect of doing this in the model system. So here you see the red line, the blue line is the base run. The base run in our publication is called Too Little Too Late. It is a story, which has been given a name which tries to describe the central characteristics of that scenario. And the base run is very well described as humanity reacting too little, too late, to the onrushing challenge from planetary boundaries. You see, with a giant leap, which is the 5 turnarounds that we are proposing, you manage to eliminate global poverty at least by 2060. So you manage to accelerate this by 30 years. And largely you do that in a model system by applying new development models instead of repeating, as I said, the liberal ideas. Inequality, we do manage to move from the blue line too little too late down to the giant leap. The size number of children. So here you see the effect of introducing health, education, contraception, etc. From the blue line down to, so instead of ending up around 2 children per woman per reproductive life, we get it down to 1.5, which is enough, of course, to make the population decline somewhat faster. The total forest area, there isn't very much we managed to do with the loss of biodiversity, but at least it's better than nothing. Greenhouse gas emissions. So here you see the spectacular decline that is possible if you just accelerate the investment in wind and sun. So we managed to get greenhouse gas emissions down to 0 by 2050. Then please notice that it is negative throughout. This means that in order to make a future which is this desirable, we need large-scale carbon capture and storage or direct air capture of CO2 from the atmosphere. If you don't do this, you get a much higher temperature at the end of the century. And the average well-being index, as a consequence, moves from the blue to the red. So at least we get, more or less business as usual the next 30 years, with the level of social tension that we have. And then well-being will start to rise at the end of the century because of the removal of poverty, because of the lower warming, because of less inequality, etc. So that's the social tension, the development, lowered from the blue line to the red line. What will it cost to do this? I spoke about the aggregate cost. Here you have the time profile of the cost, which is much more interesting, and also looking at different measures. So the cost of energy, and look at the dynamics here, because here is finally a dynamic consequence that I think is reliable and is interesting. So you see in the two. So there, sadly, the coloration is wrong. So you see in the blue line shows the too little, too late scenario, where the cost of energy is of the order of $4 trillion per year, keeping relatively stable and then declining towards the end of the century. If we introduce the giant leap thing, the accelerated introduction of sun and wind, we increase the cost. We add roughly $2 trillion per year, which is 2% of the world GDP, but it only lasts for like 30 years before the operating cost of the sun and the wind is of course much lower than the operating cost of the fossil alternatives. So you end up, having a time profile where you invest yourself out of a problem, and then in the long run, the next generation harvests the benefit. The time profile here is, of course, politically incredibly important, because, of course, it makes it very unlikely that we will do this, because the benefit from the increased cost comes 30 years in the future. Those people that are worried about the GDP per person, that we will actually have lower economic growth in the future if we implement those policies, should be assured by the graph to the right, which then basically shows that you do get a higher GDP per person if you do this. It's very sad that the label too little, too late should be colored here blue, and the giant leap red. That's a pedagogical disaster, to say the least. But we will see what we can do about this. And then the lower things basically indicate what economists would be very interested in. So what we're doing when we use labor and capital to solve problems that are not profitable is actually to deliberately lower productivity, lower labor productivity. So moving people from high productivity to lower productivity activity. And in macroeconomics, this is the total factor productivity, which is the variable, which is then basically lowered a little bit in this scenario in order to reflect the real fact that by working against the market, you're taking people that currently do very productive work into somewhat less productive work. What will it take? Well, more collective action paid by the rich is the summary. So how do we pay for it? We pay for it by taxing the rich, and that's what this graph basically shows. And in sum, again, we have the giant leap scenario, which looks like the spaghetti here. It basically tries to convey the message that in the model system, it is possible to turn around the declining well-being by acting on those 5 fronts that I have indicated. Whether this is then possible in the real world is, of course, the interesting question. I do think that if those actions were implemented, I think our forecast of the consequences is relatively precise. So the big question is, of course, will we be able to implement strong action along the giant leap? My personal belief is that we will not. I am a deep pessimist on this score. Luckily, the team in general are totally different. They're much younger, and they have the belief that if we just communicate this message well, we will be able to convince a political majority to pay what it costs, or to introduce the legislation that is necessary in order to get the 5 turnarounds changed. I'll just mention so you know it is here. In the background, there is a financial sector that I haven't spoken about at all. The main reason why I don't speak about it is that it has no impact in the long run. This irritates, of course, the financial community, but so we have here, the whole financial sector. So the inflation rate is brown, the unemployment rate is blue. The central bank reacts to the inflation rate and to the unemployment rate and gives the central bank signal rate, which is the green one. The government borrowing rate is slightly higher than the green one, and the corporate borrowing rate is slightly higher than this again, and the worker borrowing rate is higher again. So the only thing which is important here is that the financial sector accentuates the 10-year wave in the struggle between owners and workers by doing exactly the opposite of what they ought to do. So the current system is, of course, set up, according to what I just read, in order to try to lower inflation and lower unemployment. But it works in the model system exactly the other way around. It just helps, making the 10-year fluctuation in the economy much sharper. And this is easily observed. We are now in the middle of one of these financial downturns. 10 years ago was the financial crisis, and 10 years before there was the dot-com thing. So in our model, and notice here that the time horizon of this plot is down to 20 years. So these are the short-term inventory imbalance type of driven activities. Then there is the summary of the main assumptions, and this list can of course be made very long, but it's good as an end to all of this, because so what is it that we're trying to do? We're trying to build one generic model that can then be applied to 10 regions. But we want one model. The second thing, the precision level is low. You need to stress this. Only dynamics are reliable. 3, the population is split in workers and owners. 4, the economy is split in a private sector and a public sector. 5, there is a dual perspective on the economy. There is the real economy in the model, and there is the financial economy. They are separate, which is very important when we get into that detail. 6, energy is split in electricity and heat is the direct use of fuels with or without CCS. Crops are split in food and feed. Land is split in forest land, grazing land, crop land, urban land, and wasteland. And very importantly, and not mentioned this far, investment is split in A, investment in productive capacity, and B, what the financial sector is really involved in, which is investing in paper, in financial assets, which, like gold, real estate, and paper. And what is going on in the United States and elsewhere now is, of course, that we're getting a bubble, which is driven by the fact that the huge investment flows in the United States are no longer going solely into real assets, they're going into financial assets, which is a bubble that will break. And so that's the short-term forecast of the model, is that we have we're in the middle now of a financial crisis. Once we're out, it all will start again. And in 10 years' time, we will have the new next Minsky instability, which is the technical word. I think this is, of course, the way in which you should try to remember the Earth4All model, because, of course, the 1 hour of explanation is impossible. But here you see what is basically going on in our system. So we have the average well-being up in the left-hand corner, which is influenced largely by disposable income to the right and observed environmental damage. So it's the positive thing from economic growth. It is the negative thing from the effects of the footprint. Then the disposable income comes from output, the GDP, but so does the observed environmental damage. It also comes from emissions, biodiversity loss, which comes from the use of energy, food, and materials, which of course moves in parallel with the output. So when output increases, yes, we get a positive effect on average well-being because of income, and we get a negative effect on average well-being because of the footprint increase. Luckily, society is somewhat rational, so the public policy action to try to do something about the negative aspects, so the observed environmental damage influences public policy action, which actually does two things. It increases regulation, subsidies, etc., which increases the rate of greening, but below, this is important, public policy action tends to come with increased taxes, and that highlights perhaps the most important distinction in this analysis, namely between tax-financed government spending on public well-being on the one hand, and the profit-driven investment in productive activity on the other side. So when you want to make a modern and much more accurate macroeconomics theory, this split between that activity, which is policy-driven, tax-financed government spending on public well-being on one side, and the profit-driven investment in productive capacity on the other side, is important. And the interesting thing is that both of them increase the GDP. So the worker that is working on a low productive capacity in order to clean something is also adding to the GDP. So that the fact that both of them work on the GDP is important. The net taxes influences savings, which reduces the profit-driven thing. And then the spaghetti in the middle, the rate of greening, is what is important there is the learning involved. So when you start investing in a green solution, over time you accumulate volume and the costs go down. And this determines, the green fraction. And to the left is actually the vicious circle, which basically says that when average well-being goes up, the perceived rate of progress goes up, social tensions go down, and the average well-being goes up. But this group, also drives the trust into the public policy action. And if you look at the whole smear, you run the risk of trust decline. That there's a self-reinforcing negative spiral, which says that well-being declines, which means that social tensions rise, which means that trust in government goes down, which means that the government can no longer.
Wrap it up to get ready for the next one, okay?
We try to take these.
Yes, and we need to transition.
Sarah, please, 5-10 minutes.
No, it's 10 minutes over. I'm sorry, you'll need to wrap it up. I can log in remotely and do it.
So the point is that the negative spiral of declining trust and declining ability of the government to do something then leads to a further decline in well-being, which may be leading to what we call social collapse in this system. And that is, of course, the thing we really need to avoid. Thank you very much for listening me out. this is a hard job. You will get on the web, you know, the model, you will get the thousands of pages of description, which you will never read, but it will probably exist. And that is it. And I wish you all the best with the next 50 years. Obviously, we don't get time for.
Are you happy to take questions like? Or should we take questions?
Until they're aggregated.
1 minute.
Just a volunteer setting up.
Okay, so we have 20 minutes. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please do. So we are continuing the question and answer session. And those who need to leave, but just do it quietly.
Did you use inter-account or did you inspired of knowledge index methodology defined by World Bank 20 years ago? And the second question is how many decision makers or policy makers are familiar with your model?
No.
0. The second question.
0. No. So on the first one, you asked whether we had used a special technique. The answer is no. On the second one, how many decision makers are familiar?
Familiar with your model.
Yeah, 0. There are a couple of hundred senior economists on our, let's call it